Hello, and thank you for joining me for this overview of the environmental archaeology from the A14 project. My name is Dr. Michael Wallace, and I work for Headland Archaeology. My role on the A14 project was as the environmental lead during the analysis stage, as well as one of the landscape block archaeobotanists. So my aim today is to give you some insights into the environmental archaeology research of the project. If you want to learn more about the broader archaeological evidence from the scheme, then I strongly encourage you to check out some of the other videos in this series, as well as taking a look at the upcoming Internet Archaeology monograph. Fieldwork for the A14, which was undertaken ahead of the Huntingdon to Cambridge Road improvement works, was completed in 2016. We're now 7 years on, it's late 2023, and we're coming to the very end of the analysis phase. The scheme itself spans a 19-kilometre stretch of rural Cambridgeshire and unearthed 223 hectares of surviving archaeology. The scheme was divided into 8 main landscape blocks, which I'll refer to through this talk. On the western side of the River Ouse, we have Alconbury, Brampton West, Brampton South, and west of Ouse. In the central area, rising from the River Ouse floodplain onto high ground, is the River Great Ouse, Fanson and Gravels, and Conington landscape blocks. And at far east of the scheme, well away from the floodplains, is the Bar Hill landscape block. So that's the introduction to the scheme. Now let me tell you about what I've got coming up today in this talk. I'll cover 3 main areas. First, I'll tell you about the actual environmental archaeology program as a whole. I'll talk about the scale of the project. Spoiler, it's pretty big. And I will then outline the range of environmental archaeological specialisms employed and pay homage to the many specialists that have been involved. I'll then just briefly touch on the distribution of data, as this gives you some useful context to understand what comes later in the talk. In the second section of the video, I will tell you about some of the more specific and unique aspects of the scheme's environmental archaeology. As you may well expect, when you do archaeology on this scale, all sorts of intriguing and unique stories emerge. These add a lot of character to the assemblage and remind us of the oddities and chance events that make up our lives. For the third and final section of the video, I will look at the big picture. And it's my intention to give you a 3,000-year tour of how environment, economies, and subsistence developed for the people that occupied these lands on the A14. As you might expect, to get that across, I will be focused on just some of the main narratives to give you a sense of the prevailing view of our understanding of what we found. I'll bring to bear as much data and science to demonstrate the points, but I will also be emphasizing a kind of golden thread of a story that takes us through the choices and decisions of these past people. Now, in outlining the A14 scheme, I'm conscious you may well be familiar with it, and I don't really want to list a load of big numbers at you. What I do want to do, though, is emphasize 2 key aspects that have significantly added to the value of the archaeological research that we've been able to achieve with this project. Firstly, the scheme is large, but it's also linear. This means it provides a slice through the landscape, capturing all of the archaeology along that route. This then allows us to go beyond the site scale of analysis, and we can explore how different settlements and communities were interrelated. And yet, by being confined to a specific place, albeit a very large place, and conducted as a single joined-up project, we still have all of those site-level benefits of smaller projects, including deep local understanding and a fully interoperable data set. Secondly, the economies of scale do kick in when we do archaeology like this. And we've significantly more resources and expertise we've been able to bring to bear on the assemblage, and that we've been able to apply innovative approaches and employ advanced techniques. You will see some of these through the talk and in some of the other videos in this series. Ultimately, this has provided us new ways to interrogate the data and generate insights that would not often be possible on smaller projects. So all that said, I do want to give you some detail on the project scale. I'll start with the environmental sampling. The approach we use in environmental archaeology is that buckets of sediment from archaeological features of interest are brought back to our labs. There we process the samples, usually by using water suspension to separate sediment from environmental remains, such as seeds. Now, on the A14, we took just over 9,000 of these samples, and that amounted to 200,000 litres of sediment being processed. Around 10% of these were taken to full analysis. Now, when it comes to the animal bone from the A14, it was especially noteworthy, given it comprised 4 tons of bone. And this amounted to 650,000 individual fragments, all of which were brought back to our labs, washed and assessed. And in the region of 60% of the bone was analysed. Now, the total number of humans found in the project was a little over 400. Most of these were cremations. Importantly, what I'd emphasize here is that 42 of the individuals we found had a suite of stable isotope analyses undertaken, and 52 had ancient DNA analysis. I'll be touching on the paleodietary implications for these individuals at the end of my talk, but you can find out a lot more about the osteology and the study of human remains from the A14 in one of the other videos as part of this series. Now, in terms of the types of analysis we undertook on the A14, you have what I would call the bread and butter environmental archaeology specialisms: human remains, plant macroscopic plant remains, mainly seeds, and they were found in charred, waterlogged, and mineralized states; animal bone, mollusks, charcoal, which was abundant across the scheme, pollen, and insects. We also had a range of landscape and geoarchaeology level analyses, including deposit modeling that utilized the road scheme's geotechnical data, soil micromorphology, land cover modeling, sediment geochemistry. And we'll be touching on some of these results in the third part of the talk. Finally, we have what you might call the really hard science techniques. These include dating techniques such as radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, and the stable isotope analysis and ancient DNA analysis that I've already mentioned. Again, these will be coming to play later in the talk. Now, don't worry, it's certainly not my intention to take you through the results of each of these techniques during the talk, and I will just be focusing on the key findings from different techniques as and when they contribute to the main overall picture that I'm trying to paint for you. The most important thing to say about these techniques is that behind each of them is a team of highly talented and dedicated specialists. I'm hoping this list has captured everyone, but it is worth saying this is just the analysis phase experts, and I'm really sorry if I've missed you off. I promise it wasn't deliberate. We would have nothing but huge piles of meaningless dead things if it was not for all these wonderful people who derive meaning from the A14's environmental archaeology record. Now, the final section of this introduction is just to speak on the distribution of data. When the scheme is this big, it is important to reflect on where and when we do and don't have data, and how the assemblage is overrepresented in some places and underrepresented in others. And what I'm going to do is I'm using a heat map of analyzed archaeobotanical samples just to illustrate the point. But the distribution of data is very similar for all the different types of environmental evidence. Now, on screen is the heat map for all periods combined, and the darker areas represent greater concentrations of samples. If we were just to focus on the Iron Age, we can see that with the exception of Brampton West, we have a fairly even distribution of samples, and this reflects the settlement patterns of the period. There were 23 settlements, and they're all fairly small and scattered across the landscape. In the Roman period, samples remain widespread, but we can start to see there are denser concentrations in certain places, in particular around Brampton West again, but also at the River Great Ouse Villa Complex, and a possible trading settlement at Fenstanton Gravels. The Roman period saw a contraction of settlements with the total count down to 13. Finally, in the Anglo-Saxon period, settlement activity and therefore sample distribution became focused on just Brampton West and Conington, and that's where we see those heat map dots. So that should leave you with a bit of a general sense of the A14's environmental archaeology. I'm now going to turn to some of the more intriguing individual stories that have emerged from the scheme. Okay. We'll start by visiting Bar Hill at the far east of the scheme. Here at one of the many Iron Age rural settlements, and specifically in an innocuous roundhouse ditch at Bar Hill 5, there was a peculiar find. This find went on to attract some attention beyond the project and reached some of the mainstream news outlets. Now, this otherwise unremarkable ditch produced 6,919 amphibian bones, and that represented at least 434 common frogs. To put that into some context, this one ditch produced 70% of the amphibian bones from the Iron Age Bar Hill, and over half of all amphibian bones from across the scheme for all periods. Now, finding frogs is not in itself that unusual in this area. It's a wet landscape, and there's been other examples nearby of relatively large concentrations at nearby sites, but nothing on this scale. Now, as remarkable as this find is, the cause of the deposition actually remains elusive. Now, the temptation is clearly that this was the deposit of an enclave of frog-eating connoisseurs, yet there are actually no signs of butchery marks, and there's no overrepresentation of leg bones, which we might expect if they were being consumed. Indeed, there's actually no indication of any predation, anthropogenic, or from wildlife. The ditch itself was not especially deep or wet, and there's no obvious reasons why these frogs would have died en masse. There were also rodent bones, indicating that this scene of death was not frog-specific. And there's not even a reason to invoke any kind of ritual aspect, as this is a plain domestic context ditch. Ultimately, we may never know why 400 frogs decided to die here, but it is certainly one of our stranger finds, and we're always intrigued to hear more and more theories about why so many frogs ended up in this ditch. For my second specific A14 find, I'm actually going to stick with animals. Rather than a knot of frogs, and knot is apparently the collective noun for frogs, we'll be looking at a lone deer. Now, here you can see a naturally shed antler that was shed in the animal's second year or later. Zooarchaeological analysis identified this antler to be from fallow deer. Now, the story of fallow deer in Britain is that they were native up until the late Ice Age, when they went extinct in Britain. There is evidence for a small breeding herd at Fishbourne Royal Palace in Sussex, a Roman site, and then they were reintroduced at scale in the medieval period. So we have this A14 deposit, which is next to a small Roman farmstead. And this begs the question of why we have such a high status animal found only elsewhere in Britain at a palace settlement. Why is it turning up in a small rural settlement in Cambridgeshire? Now, given the potential significance of the find, the sample was submitted for radiocarbon dating to confirm its Roman age. Now, one thing that you always have to take care with radiocarbon dating is it has a knack of not always giving you the date you were expecting. And in this case, it didn't. But what it did do was give us a significantly more interesting date. The antler actually heralds from the Bronze Age. So we don't have a rare high-status Roman find at a Roman farmstead, but perhaps actually the earliest evidence of fallow deer in post-Ice Age Britain. Now, in the Bronze Age, fallow deer are considered to have been restricted to Southeast Europe. So this is really an unexpected find. And like the frogs, it's difficult to say what it means and how it happens. The antler could, of course, have been imported as a material object, or it could suggest that a population of fallow deer existed at this time in Cambridgeshire. We just don't know. The last of these short stories comes from the work by Lara Cartero, now at the University of York, on cereal-based food remains. Archaeologists, especially environmental archaeologists, spend a lot of time talking about what people ate in the past. We rarely, however, find actual food remains. Rather, we typically find the ingredients used to make food, such as cereal grains, or the byproducts of food preparation, such as animal bones. The project was lucky to have Lara on board, who is a leading expert on cereal food remains, and she was able to systematically review possible traces of food products across the scheme. And here we see some examples of charred matter under scanning electron microscope that shows things like cracked grains and cereal bran. Some intriguing aspects of this research were that porridge-like substances were dominant in prehistory, mainly the Iron Age, and these became less common from the Roman period onwards. Intriguingly, evidence for barley in foods was rare, and when it was found, it was always in conjunction with wheat. And this shows a clear preference for wheat in these kinds of food products. Barley may have been used more for foddering, or in some other ways that meant it didn't end up being preserved as food in the long term. It was also possible to detect evidence of grain fermentation, and that corresponds nicely with evidence for grain germination from the archaeobotanical record. Lara has prepared a publication on this work, and the preprint of which is available at the end of the QR code on the screen. For the final section of this talk, I want to massively zoom out. I want to make an attempt of telling you the big picture story of life on the A14 from the perspective of the environment and the economy. To do this, we need to make some broad sweeps with our interpretive paintbrush. But in doing so, it enables me to give you the character of the environmental archaeology evidence. First, we will look at the baseline natural environment, and I will talk to you about the land cover modeling work we have undertaken. I will then go on to focus on the agro-pastoral economy before finishing on an examination of human paleo diet. Now, one of the important things we wanted to do with the A14 scheme was to produce what is known as a land cover model. This type of model attempts to identify the vegetation and environments that exist along the scheme at different times. It provides the context of human habitation and allows us to explore how landscapes have evolved under human influence. Now, this type of large-scale modeling has never really been attempted in a commercial setting before, so we were somewhat in uncharted waters. Now, our starting point for the model was the topography of the area, and here you can see that the excavated areas are the squiggly lines in the middle, and the thick black line is the 2-kilometer buffer, which was what we used as the modeling area. The shading is from Environment Agency LiDAR data and shows the topography, darker colors representing lower land and lighter colors higher land. And you can clearly see the river Ouse cutting up through the scheme and then running parallel to the scheme's north out towards the fens in the northeast. We then attempted to model the most likely distribution of land cover. This was done by combining the topographic data with the results of pollen analysis from across the scheme, as well as geoarchaeological analysis and the distribution of things like wild plants and insects, especially those that are indicators of different wetland environments, for example, and wood and the distribution of trees. This work was done in collaboration with Dr. Jane Bunting at the University of Hull, and included use of the reveals modeling approach of pollen data to get a sense of the types of vegetation cover present and in what proportion. The resulting model distribution of vegetation looks like this. The famous quote by George Box is, "All models are wrong, but some are useful." And this is how you should really be thinking about this model. What it does is it gives you a sense of the landscape rather than attempting to precisely map each and every vegetation zone boundary. Now, this is the model for the Iron Age. And the key thing to take away is that everything other than the darkest green and the pale red is an open landscape, largely devoid of trees. We only have sufficient data to model as far back as the Iron Age, but what you can see is that the area around the A14 had already been cleared of its post-glacial tree cover by this time. We believe there were surviving enclaves of mature oak-rich woodland, which is the dark green, and older carr, which are the red zones, and that's a type of woody riverside environment. We can also note that the grassland, including the orange fertile grassland, were located at the places associated with the earliest settlement activity, including Brampton West and Conington. Now, in the Roman period, we see that there is little change. The main difference is that the river tree cover has likely disappeared to be replaced with a more open wetland habitat. This doesn't quite account for the reduction in arboreal pollen, however, so we also envision some reduction in the mature woodlands, and this may well be a consequence of over-exploitation of these natural resources. As we go into the Anglo-Saxon period, there are no further big changes, except a likely further reduction of mature woodland. By this time, it may have been that woodland was restricted to just the Brampton West area, where today there is the ancient woodland of Brampton Woods. And this woodland is probably the same woodland that survived at least as far back as the Iron Age. So in terms of the vegetation cover, not a huge amount actually changed. What is clear is that this area was largely open, which meant it was suitable for farming, and that woodland resources, including wood, would have been in relatively short supply within easy reach of the settlements. Now, you can explore a lot more about this vegetation modeling and learn more about the methodology at our interactive story map, which is available at the end of that QR code. So next, we will go on to look at the farming on the A14. Here, we're interested in the crops, which are mainly barley, emmer wheat, bread wheat, and rye, and the livestock, which are cattle, sheep, and pigs. It's worth saying that archaeologically, it is difficult to distinguish sheep and goat, but both the archaeozoological data and the stable isotope data indicate that goats were few in number. So starting in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, as was the case for the vegetation modeling, we really don't have sufficient evidence to say much about these earlier periods. It is worth stressing that there were Neolithic henges and Bronze Age barrows in the scheme, and there was even some Bronze Age settlement activity. But the environmental archaeology from these is minimal. What we do know is that cattle and sheep dominated the animal assemblage such as it was. Also, wild foods, both plant and animals, were important, and the ecology of the recovered wild plants indicates an open, wet, and nutrient-rich environment, and that's much as it was in later periods. Crops were present throughout, and the most notable deposit is a cache of 51 barley grains in an early Bronze Age cremation. What we can do now, though, is look at the far more data-rich Iron Age, Roman, and Anglo-Saxon/medieval periods. Now, to do this, I'm going to draw on one of the unique aspects of the A14 project, its expansive program of stable isotope analysis. Now, stable isotopes are a relatively new technique in archaeology, and what they can do is they can tell us about the life history of an organism, be that a plant, animal, or person. Essentially, depending on what an organism consumed and where and how it consumed it, different isotopes are fixed into an organism's body. Analysis of these isotopes then can give us clues as to factors affecting things like crop and animal management, as well as human geographic origin and human diet. Now here I'm going to be focusing on just one aspect of the analysis, stable nitrogen isotopes. In the very crudest terms, stable nitrogen isotopes can kind of tell you about where something was in the food chain. This is because as one thing consumes another thing, it raises its stable nitrogen isotope value by what we call a trophic level. I'm going to illustrate this to give you just a sense of what we're going to be considering for the A14 data. So let's imagine we start with soil with a stable nitrogen isotope value of 0, let's say. A plant, and let's say it's a crop, absorbs nitrogen from that soil, and in doing so, its own nitrogen isotope value is raised by a trophic level, which is around 4 per mil. Next, some livestock come along and eat this plant, and that results in their nitrogen isotope values being raised by another trophic level, in 8 in this case. Finally, we introduce the Earth's top predator, us, and we come along and we eat cattle, meaning we have even higher trophic levels. Now, one very important discovery from this research is that if you manure your crops with animal waste, the crop is absorbing nitrogen from the manure, which has already had its nitrogen isotope values raised. The consequence of that is that the nitrogen isotope values of crops are increased themselves. And of course, by how much depends on the intensity of manuring. Now, I have to be absolutely clear here. This is a gross oversimplification of complicated science. There are lots of other factors that can raise or lower stable nitrogen isotope values. The trophic level rise can be anywhere between 3 and 5 per mil. And the starting point from the soil is not always 0 and can be lower or higher. But hopefully what I've done there is just give you a kind of sense of what we're dealing with stable nitrogen isotope analysis. So let's get back to the A14. So back on the A14, here we can see the stable nitrogen isotope values for crops for each different period. The Iron Age are the blues, the Roman period are the reds, the Anglo-Saxon are the pinks, and the medieval period is represented by purple. The first thing to note here is that the values are very high, generally 6 to 9 per mil. And despite all those caveats I just said about how variable things can be, these values are actually universally high, and so likely indicate intensive manuring of crops was a prevalent practice throughout all periods. Second, though, you can see that there is a series of fluctuations. Initially, values rise until the mid-Roman period, and then in the late Roman and early Saxon periods, there is a marked drop in the nitrogen isotope values. And then as we proceed through the Anglo-Saxon period into the later medieval, the nitrogen isotope values rise steeply, reaching the highest levels we see on the scheme. We can also directly compare this to the livestock. And what you'll see here is that the values are actually very similar. That means that the crops have been so intensively manured that they look isotopically like herbivores. We also see that the same fluctuations that we see for the crops, that up and then down and then up, is present in the livestock, although it's much less clear. But that kind of suggests there may be some factor linking crop and livestock regimes. So I'm now going to go period by period, and we're going to start by focusing on the Iron Age. The Iron Age along the A14 comprised a variety of small settlements, 23 in total, spread across the scheme. Here, each bar represents one of those settlements and the composition of crops we found from the settlement. And I've only included settlements with at least 50 grains. Now, all of these settlements were rural in character and represented a settlement boom in a place which had previously only been used, for the most part, for monumental architecture. The gloom wheats normally dominate the British Iron Age assemblages, and they're represented by the greens in these charts. And whilst, as you can see, gloom wheats are very common on the A14, we do have some exceptions. Notably, there is a cluster of possible fruit threshing wheat dominated sites at Brampton West, which is the yellow here. Although it is worth noting that these are based on grain identification, which is more challenging than chaff identification, and so could actually be other poorly preserved wheats. There is also higher proportions of barley at a couple of sites, the early Iron Age Fenstanton Gravels and the early Middle Iron Age Bar Hill. So despite there being some fluctuation in crop composition, what we don't see is any settlements becoming hyper-specialist to the extent they focus exclusively on one crop. They're all focusing on typical Iron Age crops, and there's actually very little evidence for any kind of large-scale production within the assemblage, with all of them being small, low density, akin to a domestic setting. So, and at least for the data we have, you can see that crops were consistently grown under high manure conditions. Now, if we turn to the Iron Age annals, we can see a similar pattern. This is a ternary plot, and essentially everything that plots in the upper part of the figure is cattle dominated. The lower positions on the left are sheep, and pig dominated sites will plot in the lower right. As you can see, they were roughly equal amounts of cattle and sheep and goat found at most sites. Here too, there were some exceptions. Notable was Brampton West 102 and the Brampton South settlements that were particularly cattle rich, and then Fenstanton Gravels 1 had a greater proportion of sheep and goat, whilst Brampton West 1 and Bar Hill 3 were also richer in both sheep and goat and pigs. So we have a fairly normal Iron Age assemblage overall, with an emphasis on cattle, which is very typical. But within that, we have some variation. And I think overall, what we're seeing in both the crop and the livestock with these proportions is that we're seeing what's probably a greater opportunity of individualism and varied economic approaches in what was a collection of small, distinct communities, not under any kind of strict overarching control. Now, if we turn to the Roman period, as we've noted, we initially see an increase in nitrogen isotope values, suggesting a persistence and even possibly an enhancement of the Iron Age traditions of intensive manuring. This changes in the late Roman when values decrease sharply. The archaeology of the Roman period saw settlement contraction, with many of the early Iron Age settlements abandoned, reducing the total number of settlements to 13. Further consolidation occurred in the late Roman periods with the emergence of large larder settlements at Alconbury, a villa complex at River Greys, and an unusual agricultural settlement at Fenstanton Gravels, which seems to have had an especially diverse and economically active population, and may well have been some kind of trading outpost. The Roman assemblage is significantly richer than other periods, and so we're able to track the changes at settlements over time. However, what is striking is that overall, the Roman period saw a greater standardization of crop choice. There are still some exceptions, such as the greater proportions of barley at west of Ouse 3 and in the early and late Roman periods, the high numbers of pulses at Brampton West 201, though the assemblage overall is more classically Roman with a strong preference for spelt wheat. Now, whilst the Roman assemblage is generally quite rich, there are just 3 sites that dominate the assemblage: the aforementioned villa complex at River Grey Ouse, the suspected trading settlement at Fenstanton Gravels, and a rural settlement at Brampton West. However, samples that were both rich and dense in grain occur only at the villa complex and the trading centre. Now, rich and dense samples can be an indicator of the scale of production. If you consider that grains were produced as food, and so the burning of grain, which is great for us archaeologists because it preserves them for us to find, is actually a really bad thing for farmers because they're losing their produce. So charred grain can be considered a consequence of an undesirable event. Now, this undesirable event is more likely to occur when grain is handled at scale, when the chances of accidentally charring lots of grain is more likely than in a small domestic context where grain is typically handled on a more piecemeal basis. So the concentration of crop remains from the villa and trading settlements may well reflect their economic dominance at the time of the Roman occupation, and these sites may well have exerted a strong influence on the wider model of agriculture in the area, explaining the shift to standardization. Now, Roman archaeology is also known for its innovations. And one key part was the improvement in technology to enable heavy clay soils to be farmed, expanding usable agricultural territory. We can see this shift onto the clay soils using the ecology of the weed seeds we find. What we see here is that whilst the proportion of samples that contain plants indicating clay soils increases over time, and that's the proportion of the bars which are orange on the top row. But so does the proportion of plants that indicate free draining soils, which is the blue bars on the bottom line. And actually, the only place where we see deviation in the number of clay and free draining indicator species is at the two large-scale agricultural centres, where clay soil indicators outnumber free draining soil indicators. So this fits an overall pattern that these major sites were at the agricultural vanguard of the Roman period and were exploiting new arable territories, whilst the use of the traditionally farmed land was also maintained. Now, another innovation associated with the Roman period is a shift to extensive agriculture. Extensive and intensive agriculture are on a spectrum of agricultural models. Now, in an intensive system, crops tend to be highly managed. They get lots of human attention with things like weeding, tending, and manuring. In a more extensive system, that human attentiveness is replaced in part by animal labor. Extensively farmed crops, therefore, receive less inputs, and so the yield per unit of land can actually fall. But by using animals for ploughing, it is possible to farm much larger areas, and so potentially an overall much greater yield from the entire agricultural system. Now, for the A14, the dominance of the two larger late Roman settlements and the increase of clay soils at those settlements may have also been associated with an increasingly extensive agricultural system with large areas of land farmed, but crops receiving less manure, which could account for the drop in the nitrogen values that we can see here. Here too, though, it is probable that both a more extensive and previous intensive approaches were being practiced simultaneously. So what we actually see is a model of standardization and consistency, both in crop choice and in farming practices, with the exception of the large-scale crop production centres where there's a little bit more variation. The standardization and consistency is also the touchwords for the pastoral agriculture of the Roman period. Most consistent is the presence of pigs that is fixed at almost around 10% for almost all sites. The one major exception is Brampton West 201, but this is swayed by a single intact articulated pig skeleton. Elsewhere, the relative proportions of cattle, sheep, and goat fluctuate. These vary not just by settlement, but also by period. For example, at Fenton and Gravels 4 and Conington 4, the frequency of cattle remains increases over time, whilst at River Great Ouse, there is a reduction in cattle in favour of sheep and goat. We can also learn about the intended use of animals by the age at which they are killed. High mortality amongst very young animals often indicates dairying as the young are slaughtered to make the mother's milk available. On the other hand, if killing is focused at the prime age, this most likely indicates an emphasis on meat production. And finally, the retaining of older animals is an indication of the importance of traction or breeding, or in the case of sheep, wool production. Now, in the Iron Age and Roman periods, the kill-off patterns are fairly inconclusive, suggesting that a mixed economic model was practiced, with all types of products utilized in the Roman period. However, there are some more definitive peaks associated with meat production. This is notably the case at Bar Hill 5, which is seen here in red. Further, at the villa complex and at Fenton and Gravel settlements, which are the two sites where we've seen that large-scale arable activity, there was a persistence of older animals. This perhaps suggests that for these settlements, an important use of cattle was the provision of traction for ploughing, which fits with the suggestion of a more extensive agricultural model. Likely, this was too partly a mixed economy, and meat was almost certainly still important at these sites. Indeed, it is surprising how low the proportions of meat optimal carcasses are at these sites, and it may be that beef stock were being taken off-site to be culled elsewhere. Now, as we move into the medieval, which is mainly represented on the A14 by the Anglo-Saxon period, for the crops, we see an initial drop in stable nitrogen isotope values, continuing the late Roman trend, followed by a steep rise that leads to the highest stable nitrogen isotope values on the scheme. Now, looking at the crops that initially fall in stable nitrogen, that initial fall in stable nitrogen isotope values coincides with a crop agriculture system based on barley. This is a wholesale shift from earlier periods, with free threshing wheat's role much diminished and gloom wheat entirely abandoned. On the A14 then, it would seem that the earlier Anglo-Saxon phases were typified by a low-intensity system relied on barley, which is the hardier of the common crop species. Now, as time goes on, the emphasis shifts to free threshing wheat. The very high crop nitrogen isotope values are somewhat unexpected and suggest there was a far greater emphasis on high-intensity manuring. Given the very high nitrogen values, other factors aside from manuring may need to be considered, and these could include shifting agriculture onto peatlands or the use of waterlogged soils. The wholesale shift in crop choice was not repeated for the livestock. Cattle and sheep and goat continued to dominate the assemblage, with just one medieval settlement at Brampton West 5 having a predominance of pig. Mortality patterns show a much stronger emphasis on meat production, and by this stage, the evidence points to an economy with a much clearer preference for meat. Now, I'm going to bring this video to a wrap with a look at the ramifications for the farming evidence on human diet. To do this, we need one more little explainer about stable nitrogen isotopes. As we discussed earlier, as one thing consumes another, we expect a trophic level rise. And under normal circumstances, we can use this to estimate the amount of meat or plants in a person's diet by looking how far above they are crops and livestock values. Now, as you've already seen, in the case of the A14, we've seen that manuring has raised crop nitrogen isotope values so high that they're indistinguishable from livestock. And in this graph, you're seeing that on the vertical axis, and you can see that the gray symbols, the crops and the livestock, are all about in the same place. We've also got on here the carbon nitrogen isotope values. Now, carbon also goes through a trophic level rise when it is consumed through the food chain, but that's much more subtle, and it's about 1 or 2 per mil. Now, the colored symbols on this are the individual humans that have been analyzed. Now, most of them are around 4 per mil higher on the nitrogen than that cluster of crops and animals. But perhaps what is important to emphasize is that the range of values is quite narrow. And so whilst it is difficult to estimate whether crops or livestock were the major part of the diet, what we are seeing is actually there's relatively little variation in diet between individuals. Now, for the majority of this group of individuals, They're all one trophic level above all crops and livestock for both nitrogen and carbon. And so we can't really say much about the proportions of each in their diet. We actually, though, have a decent number of Roman individuals with slightly lower carbon values. As these are less than one trophic level above livestock on the carbon, but also one trophic level, but they are one trophic level above the barley. It is possible that these individuals actually had a decent proportion of crops in their diet. Either that or they are eating wild resources with lower stable carbon nitrogen isotope values. Finally, we have some unusual prehistoric people, including a Bronze Age individual who appears to be isotopically equivalent to crops or livestock. Although it should be noted that these crops are we don't actually have crop or livestock data from the Bronze Age. We also have some unusual Iron Age people that have very low carbon values. But besides these exceptions, we see very little variation in human diet. So I'm going to try and sum everything up now. I'm going to try and give you a general impression of the A14 from the environmental and economic perspective. And I'm going to address this through 3 questions. Do we see evidence for high or low variation? Do we see evidence for an emphasis on subsistence or an engagement with market economies? And were the people of the A14 primarily agronomists interested mainly in crop farming, or pastoralists interested mainly in livestock? Now, the first of these questions is actually the simplest answer. The evidence is overwhelmingly for consistency over time across the scheme. Now, there are some interperiod changes in crop farming, and there are also some atypical assemblages, such as those with more free-threshing cereals or an emphasis on pigs. But any deviation is always in the minority. There are some intriguing individual stories, but most of the human individuals appear to have been born and bred near the A14. We haven't had a chance to look at the strontium data that helps us to identify the geographic origin of people, but this shows that most people were local with a few exceptions. Now, we can characterize a subsistence economy as one with the primary focus on the sustenance of the local population. Given the periods we're talking about, none of these are likely to have been purely subsistence-based, and all would have engaged in local trade and exchange. Nevertheless, we can envision that economies primarily focused on producing surplus for consumption elsewhere may have certain traits. These include large-scale agricultural operations and specialization in the most valuable resources, things like cash crops. Evidence for either of these is lacking, and the A14 seems to have been mainly comprised of agricultural generalists. The exception is the villa complex at River Great Ouse and the trading outposts like settlement at Penston and Gravel. Both of these we see some signs of large-scale specialized agricultural practices. Now, whether people on the A14 were agronomists or pastoralists is probably the hardest question to answer. I don't think we can actually be sure on this one, and it's clear that both were actually important parts of the economy. It is notable, though, that the evidence for variation and innovation is greater for crops, and it's also apparent that the ubiquitous intensive manuring necessitated many animals to fuel the crop system. Though you could look at this as two ways, that the animals were there to fuel the crop system, or it's just a case that a lot of manure was being produced, so the best thing to do with it was put it onto the crops. So to end, if we were to attempt to characterize the periods of the A14 on a simplified schematic of subsistence versus surplus and conformity versus variability, in the Iron Age, we see the greatest level of variability, though it's still modest, and we see the least evidence for surplus economics. That said, the Iron Age surely involved lots of local interrelated settlement trade. In the Roman, we see greater market engagement as well as greater conformity, with the exception of two sites that I've just mentioned that seem to have a much higher engagement with markets. And in the Anglo-Saxon period, we probably represents a greater shift back towards subsistence agriculture, but actually even greater conformity. So I hope you found this talk interesting. If you've enjoyed watching this, I would encourage you to go check out the other videos in the series. And of course, if you're watching this live, you can drop your questions into the chat. Otherwise, you can find out more about the project by following the hashtag A14 Archaeology or going to molarheadland.com. Thank you very much.